Hello, everyone. Mr. Eford here. I hope that you guys are doing well. We are going to get started on a new unit in social studies this week, which I'm very, very excited about. And in case you couldn't tell, we are going to travel back in time to ancient Egypt. And I'm pumped. I cannot wait to get into ancient Egypt. There's a lot of cool stuff that we get to study. But to start things off, we need to go over content vocabulary. We're going to build that foundation so that uh, we've got a firm place to stand as we learn and grow and move into our study of ancient Egyptian civilization. For my students who are watching at home, please make sure that as you listen to the information in the video that you're following along, that you're filling out your note sheet, because after the video is over, you are going to have a vocabulary quiz that you're going to need to work on. So let's stay focused. Let's get started with ancient Egypt vocabulary. Here we go. First word is one that most people are familiar with, and that's because of pop culture, really more so than anything else. Hollywood, TV shows, movies, books that we read about ancient Egypt almost always will include something about this process of mummification or about the end result, which is the mummified body. Egypt is unique in this. In that not a lot of other ancient civilizations would mummify the dead body or do anything really to try to preserve the dead body after a person had died. But in Egypt, this goes along with the religious views of the ancient Egyptians. And we'll talk about why it was so important as we get a little bit further along in this lesson. The main thing you need to know about mummification is it is a practice used by ancient Egyptians of drying out the corpse, the dead body of a person who had died, to prevent rot and decay from occurring. The way the Egyptians did this, it was a process that lasted over 40 days to process and to do the mummification. They used an ingredient called natron salt to completely dehydrate the body, and then they would wrap the body in linen cloths, and they would use the sap from different trees to help solidify and almost like a glue would hold those linen cloths to the body to help preserve it over time. And that was a process that the Egyptians used. Again, we'll talk about the importance of why mummification existed in ancient Egypt a little bit later on with the lesson. All right, so here we go. Moving on. The Pharaoh. Okay, the Pharaoh is the highest of all positions in ancient Egypt. When you look at the social pyramid, pyramids in ancient Egypt, when you look at the social pyramid, the Pharaoh is at the very top. He is the leader. He is the guy who makes all the decisions. He's in charge. Okay, and if you go back to the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the Pharaoh was actually viewed as a living god. So the people had a tremendous amount of respect for the Pharaoh. They saw him as a connection between humanity and deity, or mankind and the gods. And they viewed him as this link between the two. So the Pharaoh was very highly respected. His will was followed, and he was the most important person in all of ancient Egypt. All right, we're going to move forward here. Bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the form of government in ancient Egypt, in the Old Kingdom. And we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about some of the key players in a bureaucracy. I will tell you that bureaucracies are not just a thing of the past. We still have bureaucracies today. And as we learn about ancient Egypt, we're going to make some connections between modern day bureaucracy and the bureaucracies that existed thousands of years ago in the past. For our purposes with ancient Egypt, a bureaucracy is a type of government in the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt which consisted of an administrative organization with officials and procedures. So in other words, the Pharaoh is at the top, but he delegates power to someone else who we're going to learn about in just a minute, called a vizier. And then that vizier will oversee the running of government. Okay, and the people will report to the vizier. The vizier then reports to the Pharaoh. And that was the structure of government. In other words, who reported to who enforced the law. Ultimately, the Pharaoh's at the top who makes all the rules, but the bureaucracy is in charge of enforcing those rules and making sure the people are doing what they are supposed to do in ancient Egypt. So that's a bureaucracy. That's what we're going to talk about as we go into the government of ancient Egypt. All right, here we go. We talked about this character just a minute ago, but the vizier is the person who is in charge of the government bureaucracy. This person was second in power to the Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. And the Pharaoh will really kind of delegate power to this guy to go and carry out his will, making sure taxes were collected, overseeing the pharaoh's security. These were all things that the vizier did. Ultimately, the pharaoh could override the vizier's orders if he felt that the vizier was not doing what he wanted him to do. But ultimately, the vizier really did most of the workings of government in ancient Egypt. And then he would report to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh would give him directions on what he needed to do to make sure that the government was running the way that he wanted him to. Okay. All right. So that is the vizier. He is, again, the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Here we go. Chariots. All right. Chariots are a technology that existed in ancient Egypt. We have already talked about chariots a little bit when we talked about Assyria, because we know the Assyrians used chariots as they waged war with the civilizations that they fought. And that's how they conquered all of Mesopotamia during their empire. But for our purposes, we talk about this. Chariots are horse-drawn vehicles that the Egyptians would use as a weapon of war. They learned to use these from the Hyksos, okay? And we're going to talk about in the New Kingdom, the Hyksos were a group of people that Egypt kind of struggled with a little bit. There were some battles that took place, and there was some animosity between the Hyksos and the Egyptians. But the Egyptians did learn to use this technology from them. And eventually they drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, and they took back control of their own land. But this is where Egyptians learned to use chariots for the first time, was from this group of people. Here we go, hieroglyphics. Okay, hieroglyphics are the form of writing that ancient Egyptians used. It says here it's a complex system of writing that implemented pictures used by ancient Egypt. This is a form of pictographs, okay? Pictographs are instead of using letters in an alphabet to form words like we do today, and we mesh letters together to make words and make meaning. We can have 26 letters in an alphabet. We can make every word in our language out of those letters in some combination or other. In ancient Egypt and a lot of other ancient civilizations, they would draw pictures of something to symbolize what they represented. So for the sun, you would draw a picture of the sun. If you wanted to show an ibis, which is a type of bird, you would draw a picture of that ibis. The problem is that language like that is difficult to learn, because instead of learning 26 letters that you mesh together to make words and sounds, you would have to learn hundreds, if not thousands, of different pictures that represent different items and things that you would write about. But that's hieroglyphics. This is the language of ancient Egypt, the written language of ancient Egypt. Here we go. Dynasty. And again, we talked about this when we talked about Mesopotamia, because in Acadia and Assyria and Babylon and Persia, these civilizations and empires all had dynasties. And this is where a family of rulers continues to keep the right to rule, the ability to rule in their family. They pass it down from generation to generation. And meaning that if I'm the king, then when I die, my son will become the king. And when he dies, his son will become the king. And it just continues to be passed on down this list as the generations go. Egypt has several dynasties, meaning that one family will rule for a long span of time, and then something happens and power transfers from one family to another, and you begin a new dynasty, and that family will pass power down again along that bloodline until something happens and we have a new dynasty, and we have that leadership pass from one family to another. So we'll talk about these different dynastic rules within Egypt as power is transferred from one dynasty to another, and then power is transferred from father to son within that dynasty. Okay, here we go. All right, Giza. Giza is a location. All right. If you go to Egypt today and you're looking to see those pyramids that you saw at the very beginning of this presentation, you're going to have to go to Giza. Giza is where the Great Pyramid is located. It's where most of the pyramids that we have discovered at this point are located. And of course, the pyramid is that iconic structure that we associate with Egypt. So when we talk about arts and architecture, the pyramid is definitely going to go on that list. Giza is where we're going to locate those pyramids. Okay, here we go. Hieratic script. This one's interesting because with other languages, we don't really see this take place, but with Egypt, we do. Hieroglyphics is the formal language. Okay, if a king's writing a proclamation or something is being recorded for history, it is written in hieroglyphics. But hieratic script is a simplified version of that, and it uses dashes and strokes rather than the pictures to represent the words that are written in hieroglyphics. In other words, this is shorthand, okay? It would be like the difference between what you would write on a paper that you're going to turn into your teacher versus what you might text someone on your phone, okay? The text message might be in shorthand. You might write LOL for laugh out loud, or any of those other acronyms that you use when you text. And that shortens things down to where you can say them much quicker. You can write it much quicker. In Egypt, hieratic script was the way that you did hieroglyphics shorthand. You were able to write things much more quickly, much more succinctly, but you didn't use this as a type of formal writing in ancient Egypt. All right, the Old Kingdom. We're going to talk about Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms now. And this is how we break up time periods within Egypt. And each one is distinctive, okay? The Old Kingdom existed between 2686 and 2181 BC, approximately. Again, we don't have a hard, firm date on all of this, but we can put it approximately within this period. This is when the pyramids were built. It was Egypt's very first dynasty, that first family of rulers ruled during the Old Kingdom. We're going to see how the pharaohs were viewed in the Old Kingdom as we learn our lesson. The people of Egypt viewed the pharaoh as a living God who walked among them and spoke the will of God to them. So people treated the pharaoh in almost a reverent sense, not just as their leader, but as a form of a deity. Okay. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, which exists between 2025 and 1782 BC, again, approximately during that time. This is when a new family takes over, a new royal dynasty gains control. This is a period of expansion and stability. In other words, Egypt is stable. They're not waging war with a lot of other empires and kingdoms. Things are going well for them. Their empire is getting bigger. They're strong. They're stable. The pharaoh played a new role during the Middle Kingdom. Instead of being viewed as a living god, and again, it says here in the definition, as a distant and almighty ruler, they now saw the pharaoh as a provider and a leader. Okay, so much more down to earth. They didn't view this guy as a living god. Now he's just their leader, still to be respected, still to be followed, but not with the same reverence of this guy's a god and we have to do everything that he tells us to do. Okay. All right, and then finally, the New Kingdom. This is when the Hyksos come into the picture. The Hyksos ruled Egypt for about 100 years during the beginning of the New Kingdom, and then a new dynasty, a new family takes control. They come out and defeat the Hyksos with new weapons. Their kingdom was established between 1567 and 1085 BC. This was a time of expansion, and they're known by their rich artwork and architecture in ancient Egypt. All right, we're going to talk about two different kinds of land here, the black lands and the red lands, okay? Now, it kind of sounds a little bit weird to talk about the black lands being the good place to be, but this is why it's described that way, and I'll go through the definition first, and then we'll talk about why they call it the black land. This is fertile land, which is located near the Nile River. Villages developed in this area along the river so that they could farm. You have to understand that the Nile River, just like the Tigris and the Euphrates, would have an annual flood season, which means that the river would overflow its banks and it would deposit all of this rich silt on the banks, which was good for farming. That's all of the soil and the minerals that are carried along by the river that would be deposited on the banks during this flooding time. And that made the land very good for growing crops. The silt that was left behind was really dark in color. And so when you look at the land around the Nile River, you're going to see very dark soil as opposed to what's beyond that. We'll talk about that when we talk about the red lands. But the black lands is where all the farming can be done. And so that's why the Egyptians would have viewed the black lands as a good place to farm, a place that was rich and prosperous. Okay? On the contrary, though, the red lands represent the desert. And if you go very far on either side of the Nile River, to the east or to the west, you're going to find desert land. Okay, the Egyptians referred to this as the red lands. They were on both sides of the Nile River. They were uninhabited. They were hot deserts. And even the color red was associated with, in Egyptian beliefs and mythology, the god Set. And Set was kind of the bad guy among the gods. He represented anger and hatred and war. And red was a color that depicted Set. So even here in talking about the red lands and the desert, the Egyptians would have looked at this as kind of not where you wanted to be. The place where nothing grows, it's barren. It's not a good place. Okay. All right, so Upper and Lower Egypt. Now I'm gonna try to draw this out on the board to help you guys make sense of this because it sounds completely backwards, but it's not. If you look at how the Egyptians would have viewed this, Upper Egypt is the southern region of Egypt, which sounds weird because south is going to be down. Upper Egypt you would think is going to be up, but it's not. Okay, this land was drier and more mountainous. It was not as good for farming. Okay, so let me explain why the Egyptians named Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt is in the north. Okay, let me get my drawing tools up here right quick. We'll even do this in blue since we're talking about the river. Okay, the Nile River is not entirely unique in this sense, but it's very different from a lot of rivers that you and I are probably familiar with in that the Nile River flows due north. Okay, it flows this direction. All right, so if you're looking at the flow of the river, then the upper part of the river is going to be closer to its source, where the river actually starts. So for Upper Egypt, if you're looking and using the Nile River, the upper part's going to be down here because that's where it's closer to where the river starts, where the headwaters of the Nile River are. And then by contrast, we're going to look at the definition for Lower Egypt in just a minute. Lower Egypt is going to be up here to the north because that's closer to where the river ends, the lower part of the river, okay? So that is why we get Upper and Lower Egypt the way that it is. And I'll put that definition up here in just a moment for you guys to see. All right, here we go. Let me clear that off so you guys can see the definition. So Upper Egypt is in the south. Lower Egypt, by contrast, is in the north, okay? So this is the northern part of the Egypt. This is where the delta flows into the Mediterranean Sea. This area is far more fertile. Okay, I want to explain what a delta is because you don't have it in your definitions, but it's important for us to know how the Nile River works. Okay, so as the Nile River flows north, okay, and we get close to the Mediterranean Sea, let's say here's the border of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, the Nile River, as it slows down, begins to branch out into multiple small rivers or rivulets that empty out into the Mediterranean Sea. And it almost looks like the roots of a flower or a tree coming up to where it empties out into the Mediterranean Sea. And so when the river slows down and branches out like this, we call it a delta. This land is very fertile because the river is moving so slowly here. It can deposit more and more of that silt, which is good for growing the crops. Okay, so that's what a delta is. If you look closely at Egypt on a map, you're going to see the river branch out as it gets closer to the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so let me erase this and we're going to move forward. We're going to try to wrap these definitions up here relatively quickly. All right, next up, this is our last term, the term Ka. And we're getting into Egyptian beliefs and religion at this point. The Egyptians believe that the body, the person, the soul, has two parts, two components. There's a spiritual one and a physical one. The Ka represents the spiritual body that a person has. In most of our culture and religion today, we would refer to that as the soul, okay? The Egyptians believed that the Ka, or the soul, had to have a physical body as a home to return to. And if the Ka didn't have a physical body to come home to, then it would basically disappear into what they call the duat. Okay, so this is why mummification became such a big deal in ancient Egypt, is because if you wanted your soul to continue to exist after you died, according to ancient Egyptian beliefs, your body had to still be around for the soul to come back to, which is why the Egyptians spent so much time and effort preserving the dead body so that that person's Ka could return back to the rest of its body and it would continue to exist. Okay? All right, and that is it for our content vocabulary for ancient Egypt. I hope that you guys have learned something along the way, and we'll begin to learn some of the lessons about the culture and the civilization of ancient Egypt as we move forward. That's all for now, folks. I hope that you guys have a great day. Until later, take care.